I would like to introduce the world's first and only stand-up economist, Yoram Bauman.
Great. Thank you all. How about another hand for Randy? Yeah. It's just the way we do it at comedy clubs, too. So I'm going to talk to you about carbon taxes, but first, I'm going to tell you some jokes. So that wasn't the response I expected. You're like, no, tell me about carbon taxes. My name is Yoram Bauman. I appear before you this evening, ladies and gentlemen, as the world's first and only stand-up economist. Thank you. It's a niche market. I really only have one thing going for me as a stand-up economist, and that's low expectations. When I told my father I was going to do stand-up comedy, he said, Yoram, he said, you can't be a stand-up economist. And I said, why not? And he said, because there's no demand. I said, don't worry, Dad, I'm a supply-side economist. I'm picking the audience back up. I just stand up and let the jokes trickle down. I believe in the Laffer curve. I've lost them again. That's just my joke to test how much economics you all know. And I'm going to arrange the rest of the routine accordingly. Now, I'm actually going to, when I do this carbon tax pitch, I'm going to try to pitch it to you in a way that's going to appeal to people across the political spectrum. And to begin with, that may sound difficult, but I'm going to start by doing some comedy that's going to appeal to people across the political spectrum. And this is comedy about politics. I know that sounds like a challenge, right? To do comedy about politics that appeals to people across the political spectrum, especially in a room like this in Seattle, because there's no political spectrum. But I'd like to do with you the same thing that I do when I go and I talk to the trucking executives on the banks of the Arkansas River. I'm going to divide you up across the political spectrum, all right? So this is audience participation. So for the next couple of minutes, I'm going to divide you up right down the middle, all right? And you folks over on the left side of the room, for the next couple of minutes, you guys on the left side of the room, you guys get to represent the left wing of the American political spectrum. That was actually an appropriate amount of enthusiasm for the left side of the American political spectrum. Now you folks over on the right, come on, I need you guys to come through for me. You guys are my right wing. Yeah! That was very good, right wing. But when I did this in Texas last month, they started chanting USA. I want you guys to do that for me. Come on, you guys are my right wing. USA, USA, USA. Excellent. That was great, right wing. And you guys on the left, you guys were perfect also. No, because all the right wing was chanting USA, you were just sitting there looking befuddled and vaguely unpatriotic. Now that's how most people think about politics as left wing, right wing, but if you think about economics or political science or what we call median voter theory, that actually leaves out the most important part of the American political spectrum. The left wing is actually over here, and the right wing is over here, and you folks in the middle, yes, you young man, you get to represent the most important part of the American political spectrum. You all are my swing voters. Now, a couple of very important things about swing voters, right? First of all, in America, there are a lot of swing voters. All right, if you are not a communist or a fascist, then you are probably a swing voter. And if you do not know the difference between communists and fascists, then you are definitely a swing voter. Now your job, swing voters, when it comes to politics and current events, extremely important. Your job is to pay absolutely no attention whatsoever. And then every 4 years, you determine the fate of the free world. Okay. Now, I know that sounds like a big responsibility, okay, but trust me, don't give it a second thought. And that's really how the political spectrum is divided, okay? You got the left wing. The stereotype about the left wing is spineless. You got the right wing. This starts about what the right wing is, that the right wing is heartless. And you got the center is clueless. Clueless and apathetic. You're so clueless, you don't know what apathetic means. And you're so apathetic, you can't be bothered to look it up. Now, there are also, of course, the extremes of the American political spectrum. The far right of the American political spectrum, you folks over here on the far right, you all on the far right get to be my libertarians. That's cool, you can do what you want. Okay. Far left of the American political spectrum, folks on the far left over here, on the far left, you all get to be my libertarians. I'm seeing confused looks from the swing voters. No, I had someone sitting in the middle once who was like, libertarians? You mean the people that check books out for me? And I had to clarify that libertarians are freedom lovers. Right, they come in two flavors. You got right-wing libertarians. They want everybody to be free to use guns. You've got left-wing libertarians. They want everybody to be free to use drugs. Yes. Now, both wings of the Libertarian Party want to abolish Social Security and Medicare, right? Which makes total sense, okay? Because who's going to make it to 65? When the world is full of meth fiends with machine guns. Now, many people are surprised that the libertarians of the far right of the American political spectrum, they expect the Tea Party to be the far right of the American political spectrum, but the Tea Party is actually back this way. The Tea Party is this combination of the far right and the deep center. This radical and explosive mix of radical individualism and extreme cluelessness. No, these are the people who believe in social Darwinism, but don't believe in Darwin. Now, I would make a similar joke about Occupy Wall Street, but you're not allowed to make fun of the dead. I will make it up to you later at the drum circle. I will explain to you later what a drum circle is. I've been thinking a lot about politics lately because I was in China a couple of years ago. And it was my first time in China, and I wanted to have something to say in case the Chinese people came up to me and were like, tell me about democracy. Yeah, that didn't work. That's not what happened, right? What happened was I went to China, and the Chinese people came up to me, and they were like, what's up with your budget deficit? And I had to say, let me tell you about democracy. I know, like when it comes to the budget deficit, the left blames the right and the right blames the left, but I actually blame the center. I don't think we have a budget deficit because left-wing people believe in mandates or because right-wing people believe in markets. We have a budget deficit because people in the middle believe in magic. No, let me explain, right? Every time a left-wing politician says, hey, I've got a great idea for a road or a school or a hospital, swing voters are like, yeah, let's do that. And then every time a right-wing politician says we should cut taxes, swing voters are like, yeah, let's do that. And then it turns out that we have a budget deficit and you blame the politicians, which is kind of ridiculous. Right? This is kind of like going to the doctor for your checkup, and the doctor tells you that you've been putting on weight. And the left side of your brain is like, I guess I better exercise more. And the right side of your brain says, I guess I better stop eating so many donuts. And the middle part of your brain says, I guess I better get a new doctor. Right? Then the Tea Party busts into your hospital room, right, jumps up on the crazy chair, and they're like, I know how you can cut your weight in half. Right? Like, you don't need to exercise more. And you're like, what gives you the right to interrupt my doctor's appointment? And they're like, the First Amendment. And you're like, how did you even get past hospital security? The Second Amendment. And, all right, smarty pants, what's the Third Amendment? I don't know. But I know how you can cut your weight in half. You don't need to exercise more. You don't need to stop eating donuts. You just need to use the metric system. If you did not get that joke, it is totally not your fault, okay? That is my bad. I mean, first of all, the joke makes no sense, okay? Because the Tea Party would never endorse the metric system. I mean, secondly, or understand the joke, you have to know that like 300 pounds is only 150 kilos, right? Which means that the joke pretty much only makes sense to scientists, Canadians, and drug dealers. So I want you to look around at who laughed at that joke. And if they're not scientists or Canadians. Before I go any further, I should show you my t-shirt. It's my Enjoy Capitalism t-shirt. Made in China. If you look on the tag, it's actually 80% cotton and 20% irony. I don't understand where you people are coming from, but it's okay. That totally threw me off. I don't usually get feedback on that particular part of the. Let's talk about carbon taxes. Now, I don't know. I get the sense that some of you may have different feelings about capitalism, but I'm an environmental economist, and I'll just tell you up front, what I work on as an environmental economist is using the tools of economics and the power of capitalism to protect the environment. That's why I went to UW to get my PhD. That's sort of what I'm interested in. I think capitalism, rightly or wrongly, is an incredibly powerful force in the world. And what we're trying to do is put that power to good use to protect the environment. Okay? So I'm going to transition now to the serious part of the talk. I'll tell some more jokes though still. So we're going to talk about revenue neutral carbon taxes. Okay? So very basic overview of climate change issues in 4 slides. And just for the record, I'm going to do with you all the same thing that I do with the trucking executives on the banks of the Arkansas River and like the Barry Goldwater Foundation in Phoenix, Arizona. I'll show you what I do when I talk to audiences like that, because I really do think that this idea that we're working on is a way to find common ground with folks across the political spectrum on a really difficult issue. Right? Now, you may think it's impossible to find common ground with folks across the political spectrum on an issue like climate change, but you also might have thought that it was impossible to do stand-up comedy about economics. So give me the benefit of the doubt here. All right, so first of all, let's talk briefly about climate change. So first we have this fact that carbon concentrations in the atmosphere are going up. Nobody doubts this. Nobody doubts this primarily caused by human activity, right? Burning fossil fuels and deforestation. Then we have this theory that says that if carbon concentrations go up, then global temperatures are going to go up. This theory actually predates Al Gore. At the Barry Goldwater Institute, they laughed at that joke a lot harder than you did. It goes all the way back to this fellow, Arrhenius, who was a chemist in Sweden. And in 1896, he made the first estimate of how much global temperatures would increase if we doubled CO2 in the atmosphere, which we're on track to do kind of the middle of this century. And his estimate from 1896, about 5 degrees Celsius, 9 degrees Fahrenheit, is not that far off from what climate scientists talk about today. The big difference between where he was then and where we are now is that he thought that climate change was going to be awesome because he lived in Sweden. And these days we tend to be a little more concerned about what the impacts might be of like changing the basic functioning of planet Earth. In any case, we've been running this experiment on planet Earth for the last 150 years or so, and here are the results of the experiment. The blue dots are individual years, the red bars are 10-year average temperatures going up through the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s. For what it's worth, there's the first few years of this decade. Temperatures going up pretty much in line with the projections of climate science. Now, like I said, I often talk to audiences that may not be all that bought into the scientific consensus on climate change. And so the message that I share to them is that even if you don't happen to believe in the scientific consensus, I will try to find common ground with you anyway. And the common ground comes from the way that economists think about pollution problems, which is that the way to get less pollution is to make polluting expensive. Because when you make polluting expensive, you get market forces working to promote conservation and innovation and the development of new technologies and all the things that I at least love about capitalism. And so like I said, what I work on as an environmental economist is using the tools of economics and the power of capitalism to protect the environment. A couple of policy tools to talk about, like a carbon tax or an auction cap and trade system, but the point of those policies right, is to drive up the price of fossil fuels. This is generally the part in my talks where people stop laughing, right? Because it's hard to convince people that we should be paying more for fossil fuels. But there is a side benefit to these policies, other than, like potentially saving the planet. And the side benefit is that if you do these policies right, you generate a pile of revenue. And the government can do all sorts of stuff with that revenue. The idea, I'm sure you all have your own ideas about what the government could do with a pile of revenue. The idea that I work on and talk about is that we could be using most or all of that revenue to reduce or eliminate existing taxes. So what's called environmental tax reform or tax shifting. And this is actually where I find common ground, even with folks who don't believe in climate change. So George Will, the Washington Post columnist, pretty conservative fellow, he came to one of my classes a couple of years ago. He doesn't think humans are partly responsible for increasing global temperatures, but I asked him if he would support replacing part of the payroll tax, part of the employment tax in this country, with a carbon tax. And he said that he was all for it because he hates the payroll tax. And with unemployment at 7.5%, I hate the payroll tax. Right? And Al Gore hates the payroll tax. Al Gore says we should tax what we burn and not what we earn. So I asked George Will what he thought about the fact that he and Al Gore agreed on this particular issue. And George Will said, well, he said, an idea should not be held responsible for the people who believe in it. So certainly people like economists across the political spectrum, from lefty economists like Paul Krugman to both of Mitt Romney's chief economic advisors, folks like Art Laffer, think that this is a good idea, this sort of environmental tax reform, right? Because basically what you're doing is you're replacing taxes on things you want more of, like jobs and income and savings, right? And you're lowering taxes on those things and replacing them with taxes on things you want less of, like carbon emissions. And there's even a place that's done this. So what I and many other economists consider to be the best climate policy in the world is just to our north, up in the Canadian province of British Columbia. They've actually implemented a revenue-neutral carbon tax. So implemented by a right-of-center government, if you can believe it, a few years ago. And all the money that comes in from the carbon tax, collectively about $5 billion over the last 4 or 5 years, right, has been used to reduce personal and corporate income taxes in the province of British Columbia. There's an offset for low-income households. Right? There's an offset for rural households. It's really a terrific policy. Right? And if you went around and basically asked a bunch of economists to design a climate policy, they would give you something that looked pretty much like the BC carbon tax. Okay. So how has it worked in BC? I want to show you 2 slides of how it's worked in BC. First of all, let's look at the BC economy. BC economy is in green, all of Canada is in blue. BC economy is actually outperforming the rest of Canada. So there's no evidence that the carbon tax shift has hurt British Columbia. In fact, the evidence suggests that it's actually benefited British Columbia, and there's some economic modeling that argues that this should be the case because, in particular, by reducing personal and corporate income taxes, you're reducing the deadweight loss of the tax system, and you're going to encourage economic activity. What's it done for carbon emissions? Here's motor gasoline sales. Again, BC is in green, all of Canada is in blue, starting in 2007. Right, and you can see that in Canada as a whole is now back above 2007 levels in motor gasoline consumption, right? Whereas British Columbia is about a 10% reduction. And this is true across the different fossil fuels that the BC carbon tax applies to. Overall, about a 10 or 15% reduction in carbon emissions. And this is roughly what we would expect from something similar if we did it in Washington state. So really a terrific policy in terms of the economic impacts, in terms of the social justice impacts, in terms of the environmental impacts. And so I'm part of a group that's called Carbon Washington, and we are working on bringing a similar policy to Washington state. And let me tell you briefly about how that would work in Washington state. So the big idea, again, right, is that if we shift consumption from fossil fuels to other goods and services, that can be good for economic growth, that can be good for the environment. Okay. And there's actually, like I said, the research and the empirical evidence in British Columbia points in this direction. There's actually a study that just came out in Oregon that looked at this and came to the same conclusion. There's a report that the state legislature and the governor are commissioning that is going to come out with a consultant's report in the middle of October. We're confident that they will also say that revenue-neutral carbon taxes are a good idea. Here's the policy details that we're sort of working on, and these are draft, but they should give a good sense of where we're at and where we're heading. So the idea with a carbon tax swap, right, is to balance out revenue from a carbon tax with offsetting tax reductions. So we're not going to increase or decrease the size of government. That's an argument that we can all have separately at a different time. Right? We're talking about trying to find a bipartisan way to deal with climate change. So we're going to match the carbon tax revenue with tax reductions elsewhere. If you want to look at some details, here's an example. And there's going to be a lot of words that are going to appear here because details are by their nature complicated, but I will explain them to you very briefly. So let's start with the carbon tax. So the carbon tax is going to be $30 per ton of CO2. That's basically that's the level that they reached in British Columbia. And it's going to go up with GDP every year in order to make sure that there's revenue stability over time. Apply that to all fossil fuels burned in the state of Washington. Also apply it to the carbon content of electricity that's imported into the state of Washington. And we estimate that's going to produce about a 15% reduction in CO2 emissions in Washington state, which may not sound like all that much, 15%, but it is a great, great start. Right? It is a terrific, terrific opportunity that we have, and it would generate about $2.2 billion a year in revenue for the state of Washington. That is a lot of money, $2.2 billion a year. What could you do with that kind of money? Right, you could put 1.6 of it, so the lion's share of it, you could use it to reduce the state sales tax, which is a very regressive tax. You could reduce the state sales tax by 1.5 percentage points from 6.5% to 5%. Okay, so the state rate is 6.5%. Then local sales taxes are on top of that. Right, so the state rate is 6.5%. You take about $160 million a year, you could eliminate the B&O tax, the business tax for manufacturers in the state of Washington. So what this would do essentially is it would change the system right now. If you're familiar with the B&O tax, the only way to reduce your B&O tax liability is to generate less revenue. It's a revenue tax. It's not a profit tax, it's a revenue tax. Every dollar you take in of revenue, you pay a percentage to the state. We could eliminate the B&O tax for manufacturers, and that would mean that instead of paying taxes based on how much revenue they generate, they're going to pay taxes based on how much carbon emissions they generate, right? Which clearly lines up their profit maximizing incentives as businesses with the social incentives that we have to reduce carbon emissions. Take $140 million a year, you could fund the working families rebate, which is a policy that was signed by Governor Gregoire, passed by the legislature under Governor Gregoire. It's essentially an earned income tax credit. If you're familiar with that federal program, it's the biggest anti-poverty program in the United States. This is a state level version of it, the working families rebate. It's never been funded in Washington state. So we could fund the working families rebate, which would be another way to offset impacts on low-income households. You could triple the small business B&O tax credit. So again, the idea is to essentially have the lion's share go towards sales tax reductions and then have specific smaller chunks that deal with manufacturing, that deal with low-income households, that deal with small business. So that's the policy that we're looking at. And I want to encourage you to check out our website, which is carbonwa.org. We have some folks who are here with the campaign, so our terrific campaign organizer, Claire Meinz, is here. And one of our steering committee members, Ian, is here. And let me put out a couple of asks for you, and then we can open it up for questions. So ask number one is just to get on our weekly email list, which you can do. We've got just 3x5 index cards that we can pass around. So if you'd like to be on our email list, you can either go to the website, or if you just put your name and your email address on these 3x5 index cards that we're passing around, then you'll get on our email list. Two, if you'd like to make a donation, we do accept donations, and we have forms for donations that are going around. Three, what we're looking at targeting is we are looking at a November 2014 ballot measure. So we're looking at putting something on the ballot before the voters in Washington state in November of next year. So not this November, but next November. And in order to do that, we're collecting pledges for signature gathering. So we file in January of this coming year. So January 2014 we file, collect signatures essentially January through the end of June of next year. And we're looking for folks to pledge to collect 1,000 signatures. It takes 300,000 signatures to get on the ballot. We have a target for this summer of getting 100,000 pledges. We're at about 82 or 85. So we could use help from you all to pledge to collect signatures. We think we estimate about 40 hours of work to collect 1,000 signatures. All right, we'll help you do that. It's not, I've done it before for like the Clean Energy Initiative for 937. And it takes effort, it takes time, but it's not scary. It's not that hard, and there are actually a bunch of folks here. Maybe I can have them raise their hand, people who have pledged to collect signatures. So yeah, so if you talk to any of those people who have their hands up, right, then they'll be happy to help you out and get you on the list. And we're really looking at doing this in a grassroots way. Right? So this is a grassroots initiative that we're pushing for November of next year. We have some great steering committee members. We have some great advisory board members. So our advisory board consists of Marcia Baker, who's an atmospheric scientist at the University of Washington, Shilin Su, who's an economist and a law professor who's written a book called The Case for a Carbon Tax, Dennis Hayes, the president of the Bullitt Foundation, and it's not yet officially announced, but Marty Weitzman, who's an economist at Harvard and is on the short list to win the Nobel Prize any day now, and did kind of pioneering work in environmental economics from back in the 70s and continues to do great work today. So with that, I'm going to stop and see if we have questions. And thank you all for coming, and thanks to 350.org Seattle for hosting this event.
Let me test. Is this working? Well, I have a question right away. I think I can collect 999 signatures, but I don't think I can collect 1,000. Should I still sign up?
Yes. And and we encourage folks, like if you want to work as a team, right? If you want to think that you don't want to do it yourself, but you can get some friends or housemates or spouses or whoever to join with you, then it's fine to to make a pledge as a group.
If you've been talking to people all over the country about this, why are you just concentrating, focusing on one state rather than maybe trying to get a national?
Rather than going to the United States Congress?
Well, yeah.
Well, so the thing I love about Washington State is we have ballot initiatives in Washington State. Now, I know lots of people have different feelings about ballot initiatives and Tim Eyman and all this stuff, right? My view is that ballot initiatives are no better and no worse than other forms of democracy. Right? You can have lousy measures that go through ballot measures. You can have lousy measures that go through the legislature. You can have good measures that go through both things. And you don't have ballot measures federally. And there are groups that are actually working this at the federal level. So in particular, I'd point you towards a group called the Energy and Enterprise Initiative, which is based out of George Mason University, and it's run by this guy, Bob Inglis, super interesting fellow. Hopefully we'll get him to come and speak in Seattle at some point. Again, I'm sorry, we'll come to that, yeah, sorry. So Bob Inglis is with a group called Energy and Enterprise Initiative, and what he does is he is a former Republican congressman from South Carolina, and he pushes conservatives on climate change. And he actually lost his seat in a Tea Party challenge because he cares about climate change and stuff like this. But he sort of advances this idea of revenue neutral carbon taxes and has really neat ideas. Another great group that has ideas is Citizens Climate Lobby. Citizens Climate Lobby has branches here in Seattle and a bunch of other branches all around the country. And they're pushing national action. And they work really hard with meeting with federal legislators, meeting with ed boards around the state, not just in this state, but in other states, and they're really trying hard to push things at the federal level. My own view is that it's going to take state level action to sort of motivate the federal action. And if you want to make an analogy with healthcare in Massachusetts, then you can. But basically the same sort of thing, like the states are the laboratories of democracy, and taking action in a few states, and Washington and Oregon are actually in perfect position because we're in between British Columbia, which has its great carbon tax, California, which has a cap and trade system, and both Washington and Oregon are sort of relatively progressive states, green governors. They want to do something about climate change, and geographically they're sort of in this great position to do something about climate change. Okay.
What percentage of the Washington revenue is that 2.2 billion?
Total, it's on the order of 10%.
Why not go 15 or 20?
Well, so I guess I would give two answers to that question. First of all, there's an issue of how far one state or one province can go ahead of other states and provinces. So they actually have this discussion in British Columbia. So British Columbia has hit $30 per ton of CO2. So to put that in perspective, $30 per ton of CO2 is the equivalent of 30 cents a gallon of gasoline, 3 cents a kilowatt hour of coal-fired power, 1.5 cents for natural gas-fired power. And there are folks in BC who say, look, in order to hit our targets, we're going to have to go up to like $100 or $200 per ton of CO2. My own view as an economist is that the point of the policies in BC and the point of the effort that we're doing here in Washington State is not to solve climate change in the Pacific Northwest. Right? Washington State is 0.5% of world carbon emissions, less now that China is more. Right? The point of the policy is to point the way forward for the nation and for the international community to move in a similar direction. And so what we're trying to do is not necessarily, we're not trying to solve it here as much as we're trying to point the way for bigger forces in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere to move in the same direction. So we're trying to demonstrate that you can have a successful policy like this. If you wanted to talk about, you know, I think throughout the climate debate, there's this contrast. There's the challenge between where we need to be in terms of the climate, which Randy pointed out in one of the slides in his talk, right? How much we need to reduce carbon emissions and how fast we need to do it and how we're moving in the wrong direction right now. So there's a contrast between where we need to be and politically what we seem to be capable of doing. And you can take different sides of that. We happen to think that the policy that we're working on is sort of in a nice middle ground to something that is going to be significant, but that we can also accomplish.
I've been studying Jim Hansen's proposals about carbon tax, and I've come to really like it, particularly his point that if you do a tax and then a full refund, just don't keep any of the money, it ends up being pretty progressive because people who burn a lot of gas and have big houses and stuff like that, they wind up paying more, and people who have less get a bigger percentage of it. Now, it looked to me like on your sheet there that it was actually, I would describe it as regressive because it cuts the tax that people have to pay, the sales tax, but it just gives that small amount into the family fund. I'm not sure of this, and I was just wondering if you contrast the full refund to your proposal.
Sure. So my own view is I'm relatively unitarian about carbon pricing. Like there are some people who are like, oh, we have to have a tax, or oh, we have to have a cap and trade, or oh, we have to do this with the revenue, or oh, we have to do that with the revenue. I'm fairly open in terms of anything that puts a price on carbon. I think it's probably a step in the right direction. The advantage of the dividends system that you're talking about, so Jim Hansen and 350.org, Jim Hansen and Citizens Climate Lobby, work on this dividend idea, which says, kind of like the Alaska Permanent Fund, let's take the money from a carbon tax or an auction cap and trade system, and let's just cut a check equally to everybody in the state or everybody in the country. There's some economic issues that we can talk about if you want. The benefit of that policy is it is incredibly progressive. Right? Even though low-income households use more energy as a percentage of their income, they use less energy overall than higher-income households. So dividending the money back to everybody on a per capita basis turns out to be a very progressive way to deal with the social justice aspects of that. The challenge in Washington State in particular is that it probably doesn't pass muster with the state constitution. So the state constitution has a prohibition on gifts of public funds, and what we hear from lawyers is that you have to be very careful about that in the state of Washington. You could potentially do something federally. We think that the proposal that we're looking at between the sales tax reductions and the working families rebate is it's not going to be super progressive, but it's not going to be regressive either. We think that this is a fair policy and is a good way to address the social justice aspects while moving forward with climate change in Washington State.
So you're working on this as a grassroots program, which is laudable and great, and it's all what democracy is about. It looks like you have the opportunity for really getting some friends with deeper pockets involved as well with your elimination of the B&O tax. Has anybody stepped up? Is Boeing interested? Who have you talked to?
We've talked with some of the business lobbies and some of those folks in the state, and we're having some conversations with people that have some deep pockets, and hopefully we'll get some of those folks on board.
Are some of these particularly directed to get their attention? I mean, you could just do sales tax, and then obviously you're not getting the attention of Boeing or Weyerhaeuser.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that the biggest challenge that we face when we have conversations with some of those folks is, and this is, I think, the biggest challenge that we face overall when you just talk to sort of average voters or whatever, is people say, yeah, you're going to implement this carbon tax, but you're not going to reduce these other taxes. So there's kind of this trust in government issue, this cynicism about government that you can see. It's not just with carbon taxes, it's with any kind of taxes, right? We saw it, if you remember Herman Cain's 999 plan from the right. People said, yeah, you're gonna like implement the national sales tax or whatever, but you're not gonna get rid of the federal income tax. You see it with healthcare where people don't like the health system that we have now, but they're sort of terrified of doing something that's gonna change it. So dealing with that cynicism, that distrust issue is something that we encounter both with average voters and also with some of the corporations and other deep pocket folks that we talk to. And we think that when we actually move forward with putting it in writing, that's going to be the best way that we can show them that we're serious about doing this.
We're currently dealing with an onslaught of new terminal proposals for new terminals, export terminals, and and pipelines. And so I was wondering, what do you think about taxing exports, carbon exports as well, instead of just fuels burned in Washington?
It's a great question. It's a great idea. What I think about it is mostly what I hear from lawyer friends who say that it's unconstitutional federally. So federally, it's federally, like one state can't pass restrictions on trade in that way, is what I hear from the lawyers.
Hi, all the way in the back. Hi. So I'm not from here, and I'm not very familiar with the carbon tax or even like the issues in Washington. I'm actually from Michigan, Detroit actually, so I understand money problems. I guess my question is, when you start taxing the CO2 emissions, my first thought is that the company is kind of going to start passing that off onto the people who actually buy their product. So what kind of predictions do you have as to how that's going to affect gas prices or things that like the average Joe has to pay? So you might have covered that. I came in late. I'm not sure, but it's something I'm interested in.
Yep. So that's a great question. And as an economist, I am duty-bound to tell you that I can't offer you a free lunch. What I can offer you is value for money. Okay, so fossil fuel prices are going to go up. That's the way that carbon pricing works. And if you think about it in terms of from the consumer perspective, if fossil fuel prices don't go up, consumers are not going to have an incentive to change their behavior. And that ultimately what we need is an incentive for folks, for all of us, to change our behavior from more fossil fuel intensive activities and goods and services to less fossil fuel intensive goods and services. What I can tell you is we're going to take that money from the carbon tax and we're going to use it to lower other taxes that you pay. So we're going to lower sales taxes, we're going to provide this working families rebate for low-income households so that overall, average households are going to be sort of made whole by the tax reductions.
Yeah, kind of related to that, can you just describe again a little bit more about the working families rebate, what it provides, and how much to whom, as much as you know that?
So the working families rebate, let's start with federally, there's an earned income tax credit. So the way that works is if you're low income and you're working, instead of paying money to the federal government on April 15th, they send you a check. So it's a bump up of your income that comes from the federal government. Largest anti-poverty program in the United States. There are a bunch of states, I think 23, maybe 25 states that have state level versions of this. So basically the way they work is if you get $1,000 from the feds, you get $200 from the state. And those programs work through the state's income tax programs. Washington State, as you all know, doesn't have an income tax. But a few years ago when the legislature passed this and Governor Gregoire signed it, they implemented this as a sales tax rebate. So it's framed as a sales tax rebate, but it works the same way as all these other states' earned income tax credit bump ups, which is if the feds give you $1,000, excuse me, if the feds give you $1,000, the way this program would work is Washington State would give you 10% of that. So they'd give you an extra 10%. Now that's never been funded, right? So the program sits on the books, but the checks have never gone out. But it's possible to do it as if you could provide money. The $140 million a year actually is not just a 10% rebate for low-income households in Washington State, it's a 20% rebate. The idea being that the first 10% is to help kind of offset impacts from the carbon tax, and the second 10% is to actually provide this boost to low-income households.
I'm concerned about running this policy strategy through the money system because the people who have access to money They basically have a get-out-of-jail-free card because they control the apparatus of the banking system and corporations. So have you talked about a rationing system? For example, it could be run through the card services network, similar to how we saw the Intera card in recent years. The card services network on all the supermarkets and every place, they're required to grant equal access to other people besides just the big companies. And you can run alternative currencies through there, such as your ration allowance for carbon for this month.
I guess I think that's an interesting idea. I would love to know more in terms of the policy that we're working on. I think that our policy is a good way to tackle climate change and do it in a way that economists can support and folks across the political spectrum can support.
So basically, it's just to clarify, if I'm understanding this right, all of those, if you were having to file today
Yep.
For this statewide citizens initiative, would you have all of these tax reductions be possible? It would go something like this. Okay, great. That's just what I wanted to know.
And in fact, we filed a test run initiative. So we actually have ballot language and stuff like that. That's draft ballot language that we got. Yeah.
Given that I'm eternally optimistic, I want to know how companies are going to get around paying this.
They're going to get around paying it by reducing their carbon emissions. Oh, yeah. You're not really optimistic. No, so the cool thing about carbon emissions is that even though carbon emissions sound like, oh, like they're invisible or whatever, right? But they actually come from fossil fuels, and fossil fuels are one of the most highly tracked commodities in the world. It's very difficult to like bring a rail car load of coal into the state without the tax authorities knowing. And so essentially what you do is if you track the fossil fuels, which we do really well in this state, in this country, pretty much all over the world, if you track the fossil fuels, you can tax the fossil fuels, and most of these fossil fuels already have taxes on them. We pay gas tax, we pay utility taxes, things like that. And so I don't think that there's going to be a good way for corporations to reduce their carbon tax burden without actually reducing carbon, which is what we want them to do. Well, thanks again to 350 Seattle for inviting us to join, inviting Randy to join.